Every case leaves a trace, a name, a date, a question that was never answered. This is Silent Shadows. For 10 weeks in the spring of 1946, darkness changed what it meant to live in Texarkana. Couples stopped parking on quiet roads. Families checked their locks, kept weapons close, and watched unfamiliar cars pass their homes. By the time the attacks ended, 5 people were dead and 3 had survived serious wounds. The person responsible was never identified, at least not with enough evidence to bring anyone to trial. Texarkana is really one community divided by a state line. Texas lies to the west, Arkansas to the east, with separate police departments, sheriffs, courts, and legal jurisdictions. That division would complicate an investigation spanning rural roads, city streets, and farmland. But before anyone understood that a series might be unfolding, there was simply a young couple, a secluded road, and an armed stranger approaching through the night. The first known attack occurred on February 22, 1946. Jimmy Hollies and Mary Jean Larry had been out together and stopped along a quiet road outside the city. Places like this were commonly used by young couples seeking privacy. There was nothing remarkable about being there. Then a man appeared with a flashlight and a gun, his face hidden beneath what the survivors described as a white, sack-like covering. The attacker ordered Hollies and Larry out of the car. According to their accounts, the mask had openings cut into it, allowing the man to see while concealing his identity. He told them not to look at him. When Hollies hesitated or failed to follow an instruction quickly enough, the attacker struck him repeatedly with the pistol, fracturing his skull and leaving him badly injured. The violence did not end there. The gunman forced Larry away from the vehicle and pursued her along the road. She was assaulted but eventually managed to escape. Reaching a nearby house where she could call for help, both victims survived, giving investigators their first descriptions of the attacker. Yet trauma, darkness, and the concealed face meant those descriptions could offer only a limited picture. They described a man armed with a handgun, speaking in a controlled and threatening way. The sack-like mask became the detail people remembered, though even that point was not entirely consistent. Hollies later recalled features differently from Larry. Possibly because each had seen the attacker from a different angle, that uncertainty mattered. In a frightened community, a single vivid detail can quickly harden into legend, even when the evidence remains incomplete. At first, the assault looked like an isolated crime. Police had 2 surviving witnesses, but no clear motive and no recognizable suspect. The location suggested the attacker might have known where couples went for privacy. Beyond that, investigators had little to work with. Weeks passed without another publicly connected incident. Then, almost exactly 1 month later, a second couple encountered someone on another secluded road. On March 24th, the bodies of Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore were discovered near Griffin's parked car outside Texarkana. Both had been shot. The circumstances suggested they had been together when the killer approached, possibly while sitting in or standing near the vehicle. Unlike Hollies and Larry, neither survived to describe what happened, leaving investigators to reconstruct the encounter from the position of the bodies and the physical evidence. Reports from the scene indicated that blood found outside the car may have meant the victims were shot there and then moved. Both had suffered gunshot wounds to the head. There was no obvious robbery motive that could fully explain the attack. Once again, the setting involved a couple alone at night, away from witnesses. That similarity immediately raised a frightening possibility. The February attacker had returned, and this time he had killed. Investigators examined bullets and cartridge evidence, focusing on a handgun believed to be a .32 caliber automatic. Ballistics in that era could compare markings and help connect ammunition to a particular weapon, but the science depended on what could be recovered intact. It could suggest links without revealing who had pulled the trigger. Police now had patterns, but patterns are not identification, and the attacker had left no reliable name or face behind. So let's pause here. By late March, Texarkana had 1 surviving couple and 1 murdered couple, all attacked in isolated locations after dark. Police could warn the public, increase patrols, and question people with criminal histories. What they could not do was predict the next location. The border region contained miles of roads, wooded areas, and scattered homes. An offender familiar with that landscape could disappear simply by driving a short distance. The next attack came during the early hours of April 14th. Betty Jo Booker, a teenager and talented saxophone player, had spent the evening performing with a band at a veterans club in Texarkana. After the dance, she left with her friend Paul Martin. At some point after they drove away, their ordinary trip home became the beginning of the case's most extensive and baffling crime scene. Paul's body was found first, lying beside a road near Spring Lake Park. He had been shot several times. His car was later located elsewhere, creating an immediate question about movement. Had the killer forced the pair to drive, taken control of the car, or transported one of them after the shooting? Betty Jo was missing, and officers began searching the surrounding roads and wooded ground for any sign of her. Several hours later, Betty Jo's body was discovered nearly 2 miles from where Paul had been found. She too had been shot. Her saxophone was missing and would become one of the case's enduring pieces of absent evidence. Whether it had been taken as a trophy, discarded somewhere, or removed for an unrelated reason was never established. The distance between the bodies suggested a prolonged encounter that investigators could only partially reconstruct. Now here's where it gets especially unsettling. The killer appeared able to control 2 victims and move through the area without being noticed. That may indicate a weapon was used to force compliance. It may also suggest the attacker had access to a vehicle and knew the local roads well. But those are deductions, not certainties, without witnesses. Every reasonable reconstruction still left room for another explanation. The deaths of Paul and Betty Jo transformed public anxiety into open fear. These were young people with families, friends, classmates, and a visible place in the community. Betty Jo had been seen performing only hours before her death. Their movements could be traced up to a point, and then the trail vanished into darkness for many residents. That made the danger feel both close and impossible to anticipate. Law enforcement expanded patrols across both sides of the state line. City officers, county deputies, Arkansas authorities, Texas authorities, and state investigators all became involved. Roadblocks were established, vehicles were stopped, and suspicious people were questioned. Officers watched lovers' lanes and other isolated areas, yet coordinating such an operation was difficult. Each agency had its own records, leadership, jurisdiction, and legal procedures, all without the instant communication available today. One of the most visible investigators was Texas Ranger Manuel Gonzalez, a well-known lawman whose arrival attracted substantial press attention. Reporters followed developments closely, and newspapers needed a name for the unknown attacker. They began calling him the Phantom Killer. It was memorable. But it also turned an unidentified person into something almost supernatural, an image larger and more certain than the limited evidence actually supported. The nickname spread quickly. Stories emphasized the mask, the night roads, and the killer's ability to vanish before patrols arrived. Rumors traveled even faster. Residents reported noises, prowlers, strange cars, and shadows outside windows. Many reports were probably unrelated. But police could not simply ignore them. Every call might be nothing. Every call might also be the one lead capable of preventing another attack. People changed their routines. Couples avoided isolated roads. Businesses reportedly saw greater demand for guns, ammunition, locks, and other forms of protection. Neighbors organized informal watches, while armed residents waited inside darkened homes. That response created another danger. Frightened people might mistake an innocent visitor or police officer for the killer. Texarkana was heavily patrolled, but the atmosphere itself had become volatile. For almost 3 weeks after the deaths of Paul and Betty Jo, no further commonly linked attack occurred. Perhaps the patrols were working, perhaps the killer had left, or perhaps he was simply waiting. Then, on the night of May 3rd, violence moved away from parked cars and secluded couples. It reached a farmhouse in Miller County, Arkansas, several miles northeast of Texarkana. Virgil and Katie Starks were at home that evening. Virgil was seated inside when shots were fired through a closed window from outside the house. He was struck and killed before he could defend himself or identify the shooter. The attack was sudden, carried out against a victim inside his own home. That distinction would later fuel debate over whether the Phantom Killer was responsible at all. Katie Starks heard the gunfire and came toward the room. She was then shot and seriously wounded. Despite her injuries, she remained conscious and attempted to respond as the attacker moved around the house. She ultimately escaped and reached a neighboring home where help was summoned. Her survival was extraordinary, but like the first victims, she had been attacked under conditions that made a useful identification nearly impossible. The Starks farmhouse offered investigators a different kind of scene. This was not a couple parked on a remote road, it was an occupied residence. The shots had come through a window, suggesting the attacker had approached the property deliberately and could see his target inside. There were also indications that someone attempted to enter or move around the home afterward. The crime felt connected by timing and terror, but its method was different. Most importantly, the weapon appeared to be different. Investigators associated the earlier shootings with a .32 caliber handgun, while the Starks attack involved a .22 caliber firearm. One offender can use more than one weapon, of course, but a change in caliber, victim setting, and approach gave investigators legitimate reasons for caution. The Starks shooting may have been the final phantom attack, or it may have been a separate crime committed during the same fearful period. After May 3rd, the commonly accepted series stopped. No more attacks were conclusively tied to the same offender. That silence created its own list of possibilities. The killer may have died, moved away, been imprisoned for another offense, or chosen to stop. Increased police pressure may have deterred him. And if more than one person was responsible, the apparent ending may be nothing more than separate timelines being mistaken for one. Police pursued numerous suspects and examined reports from across the region. Men were questioned about weapons, vehicles, alibis, and their familiarity with the victims. False confessions and unsupported accusations complicated the process. High-profile crimes often draw people seeking attention. While community fear can turn ordinary behavior into suspicion, investigators needed more than a disturbing rumor. They needed evidence connecting one person to the scenes, the ammunition, or the victims. The suspect most often discussed in later accounts was a repeat car thief named Yowell Swinney. His wife reportedly made statements accusing him of being the killer, then changed or withdrew parts of her account. Legal restrictions involving spousal testimony created additional problems, and investigators lacked physical evidence strong enough to establish that Swinney had committed the murders. He was imprisoned for unrelated automobile theft, but he was never charged in the Phantom case. Swinney's status shows the difference between a suspect and a proven offender. Investigators may privately believe someone is responsible while still lacking admissible evidence for court. A confession from another person can be unreliable, especially when recanted. A criminal record does not prove murder. Without the weapon, trustworthy eyewitness identification, or physical evidence tying Swinney to the attacks, suspicion could not become a conviction. Other proposed suspects faced the same basic problem. Decades later, popular culture added another layer. The case inspired books, articles, and the film The Town That Dreaded Sundown. Those retellings preserved public awareness, but they also blurred fact, dramatization, and local folklore. The image of a hooded figure stalking couples became more familiar than the uneven evidence. If we strip away that mythology, what remains is a short sequence of attacks whose connections are persuasive in some places and uncertain in others. The established toll is 5 people killed: Richard Griffin, Polly Ann Moore, Paul Martin, Betty Jo Booker, and Virgil Starks. Jimmy Hollies, Mary Jean Larry, and Katie Starks survived. Their experiences formed the beginning and the possible end of the series. Behind every theory are 8 people whose lives were taken or permanently altered, along with families who never received a trial, a verdict, or a definitive explanation. And that is why the Texarkana case still holds attention, not because the attacker was truly a phantom, but because an ordinary human being managed to remain unidentified. The investigation produced patrols, suspects, ballistics comparisons, witness statements, and years of speculation, yet no charge ever settled the question. Somewhere within those 10 weeks, the evidence stopped just short of a name. Nearly 8 decades later, that missing name remains the central silence in the story. If this case stayed with you, there are others waiting. Subscribe to Silent Shadows and walk with us into the next one.